It's also my privilege to introduce our speaker today. Our speaker will be presented on video. All right, so let me please introduce Jennifer Matheny. Jenny has taught biblical and theological studies for the past 8 years. I think she's beaming into us right now. Okay, she is currently a professor, associate professor of Old Testament at Nazarene Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri. So Jenny has a special interest in analyzing and teaching passages in the Old Testament. So she shared in her bio that she likes to take a look at some of those troublesome Old Testament texts that are full of violence and problematic issues for today. And she loves to create these safe spaces for her theological students to debate and figure out practical applications for those texts. She is the daughter of our own crosswalker, Karen Kenny. And when I was sharing with my husband, Travis, that I was going to be doing the intro today because someone else was ill, he said, "Wait, are you talking about Jenny Kenny?" And I said, "Yeah, Jenny Kenny." And he said, "Oh, I had her as a student 25 years ago." And for someone to remember a student, he just said she was like someone with such a high integrity and ability to really focus, and was just such an exemplary young woman. So he was thrilled to know that I would get to introduce her. In fact, he had to open his Facebook and show me all the pictures of Jenny because he's friends with her. So anyway, we're glad to welcome Jenny via screen today. Thanks.
Good morning, Crosswalk. It is a joy to join you this morning. I am Jenny Matheny, and I'm coming at you from Manhattan, Kansas. And I'm so grateful to join you by video this morning. I was honored when Pastor Pete asked me to join the all-star lineup of preachers and speakers while he is on sabbatical. I know it has been a delayed sabbatical because of COVID and everything, but I'm so grateful that he has this time of rejuvenation and for you all to wreak some havoc while he is gone. I'm just kidding, kind of. But I'm grateful to join you today and to share some of my research. I'm currently the Associate Professor of Old Testament at Nazarene Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri. For those of you new to Crosswalk, I actually attended there with my family during a time of difficult transition. I grew up in Napa, went to Napa High, so I know your context very well. My mom is an active member of Crosswalk, and you may know her, Karen Kenny. Hi, Mom. And we absolutely love this church and everything you are doing in this community, everything near home and around the world. You all are truly part of something special. As an Old Testament professor, I have to say I am often amazed at how very human and imperfect the people in the stories in the Bible are. We often turn to the Bible for models or these like ultimate examples of how to live this life of faith right. And every time I'm amazed, right, at how often they get it wrong. Yet even so, somehow this is deeply encouraging, and this gives us hope. They mess up, but they keep trying. Eugene Peterson writes that we are on the hunt for someone to look up to. But people around us, even celebrities, often, they're messing up. So we turn to the Bible, right? We think, oh, maybe there we're going to discover some mature and authentic person to emulate. But again, we're surprised. Peterson writes that one of the first things that strikes us about the men and women in Scripture is that they are disappointingly non-heroic. We do not find splendid moral examples or virtuous models. They always come as a shock to newcomers to the church or to learning the Bible for the first time. They're like, oh, Jacob cheated, Moses murdered or complained, David committed adultery, Peter denied he knew Jesus. The person Peterson describes as one who really to him exemplifies a life of powerful faith, though, is actually the prophet Jeremiah. So that's who we're going to focus on today. Jeremiah was a prophet who lives in Jerusalem during the time of the Babylonian Empire. He is going to be part and be there during the destruction of Babylon in 586 BCE. For those of you that might be interested on a fun version, Patrick Dempsey, who played McDreamy in Grey's Anatomy, actually stars as Jeremiah in a film from like 1996, so you might want to look that up at some point. Super fun. But in Jeremiah's ministry, in the biblical text, there were moments that Jeremiah wanted to quit, to give up, but he didn't. I think Peterson gets it right here with Jeremiah. When I think through my life or the lives of my friends who are trying their best to follow God, they have rough patches, right? We all do. But they press on. And I think that is one of the things that I love about Jeremiah. Life gets hard, even unbearable at times. He gets frustrated, but he presses on because he knows that even when everything seems to be lost, that if God is in the equation, there's always hope. And God is always in the equation. So today I want to dive into a book and a prophet that I love. Like many people called by God, he struggled to see himself as worth God's time. When he called, he actually resisted. He said, I'm too young. His life of faith was full of struggle, but it was also full with God. And even in the lowest points where he was falsely imprisoned, falsely accused, lies were said about him, God was still as close as his next breath. So Jeremiah is one of those people in the Bible that you do get to know a bit more than some of the others, but still, there's a lot we don't know. One of the fascinating areas we're able to witness, actually, and to get to know him is his emotions. You don't always see that with the characters in the Bible. He's all over the place, from weeping to like tons of emotions. He's like, even moments he has rage. And so, but also, even along this anger, right, that he is encouraged to express, and I want to talk about that today, he also has tangible acts of hope. And the two things that I want to focus on today are those things of his life, his emotions and his tangible act of hope. I think what draws me close to this prophet is how human he was. It helps me see that when I struggle to follow God, all the stuff I experience, from the great days of incredible faith when everything seems right, to feeling very unsure about things, that really all of this is part of our journey of faith. So all this points to God's desire to be in relationship with us. God invites us to express all of our feelings because really God does care. And even when life gets hard, there is always hope. So as you may have noticed, there are many strong emotions flowing all over the place in our world today. We may even find within ourselves, if we're honest, that this is kind of uncomfortable. We see others express things and we struggle. Maybe we're annoyed. We may at times be like, wowzer, dude, chill out, right? As a parent, I often find my children expressing strong emotion once in a great while. So anyways, and often their expression of emotion is a little bit disproportionate to the circumstance. So for instance, the weeping and cries of frustration that I've heard from the back of the car from my then 3-year-old, now he's 18, but he's melting down, his granola bar just broke in half, right? And he's like, things in the world are not as they should be. So anyways, I'm sure many of you can relate. Once, my son was trying to communicate a lot of extreme discomfort at being very hungry. The conversation went like this. He yells, I hate God. He shouts this from the backseat of our Honda. The year was 2007. Sam right then is 3 years old. My husband and I were in the front seats, and Sam was angry. Something was amiss. As graduate theology students, my husband and I, we were serving in a Canadian Anglican church at the time. We just sat there for a moment in silence. Really, our 3-year-old hates God already. I calmly looked back at the raging blonde 3-year-old and asked, gently, Sam, would you like a sandwich? Yes, he yelled back. I handed it to him. He took a few bites, and then he started humming. This moment could have been understood as a theological crisis or perhaps some strange indoctrination, right, in his preschool setting. I could have decided to engage the actual words spoken, but fortunately I knew that when my son Sam got hungry, everything in his little world falls apart. And so all he knew was that he doesn't feel good, and he wanted to get my attention. And also, he wanted to communicate this. So why does Sam's hunger equate to hating God? Sam was aware, I imagine, that his parents valued God. Sam valued feeling good. What could get our attention better than this intense statement? I was actually really impressed with his choice of attention-grabbing rhetoric. What else would crumble our world as fast as his world was seeming to crumble? Even at 3, Sam knew that we were very interested in this God thing with our jobs and our education at seminary. So often intense emotions are connected to things that we value. And what I want to share today in my research on the prophet Jeremiah, I just want to demonstrate that his emotions actually help us see what we care about, what our core values are, and perhaps we can become open to listen to these emotions in order to better understand ourselves and the values of others better. And I'll be honest, this is not easy work, but I sense as we navigate life and the importance, like differences among us that are important to understand, we begin to see the values that each of us brings as we grow and we shape one another together in community, as we seek to love God and one another well. The prophet Jeremiah helps us peek not only into his life and ministry as a prophet, but also into the expansive heart of God for all of us. And it is my hope today that you begin to see God's incredible care for us and for you, that it will help us hold space for one another as we navigate the complexities of our values as Christians and work intentionally to love one another well. So for this message today, what I would like to do is to first introduce you to the role of the prophet in the Old Testament. Then I want to give a brief overview of the context of Jeremiah and focus in on the value of emotions that he had and how they are important, really, to have a relationship with God. And finally, I want to share one of my favorite moments in the story, a moment where Jeremiah makes this crazy real estate purchase, one that makes no sense in its context, yet makes complete sense as a beautiful symbol of hope in a world that is falling apart. My hope is that you will be encouraged today to hold space for one another as we navigate complex emotions in our world, and to be encouraged of our hope in Christ. And even when the world seems like it's falling apart, that God is making all things new. So, what's a prophet? Glad you asked. The prophet is someone called by God really to stand in a difficult space. They were the voice of God. They stood in the gap, reminding people, calling them back to return to God. There are many prophets in the Bible. We have Miriam and Moses, Deborah, before the literary prophets. Then we have like Elisha and Elijah in the historical books, Samuel, we have Nathan. Then we have literary prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. As the institutions of power over the people became sometimes corrupt, the prophet would often speak into that unjust institution. They had a right to be in the presence of the king and tell him what to do, because the king is under God, and the prophet was a very important person in that space. So the prophet often challenges the dominant voices in power. The prophet mediates the covenant of God, reminding people to return to the Lord, worship God alone, remain obedient. If they refused, there was also often a message of judgment from the prophet. Now, this prophetic office was not unique to God's people. There are prophets all throughout the ancient world. But what's unique about the prophets in the biblical stories is their message. Fundamentally, Chalmers writes, a prophet was an intermediary. He or she was called by God to stand between the divine and human realms. So, prophets, they're called by God. Most actually in this call respond quite negatively. They often have excuses why they should not be chosen. Isaiah is unique in this. His response is, "Here am I, send me." Moses and Jeremiah, though, are all full of excuses, right? Why they aren't made of the right stuff. But God sees beyond insecurities and doubt. And God sees beyond your insecurities and doubts too. A prophet communicates the word of the Lord. They're an intercessor. They're a sentinel, like a watchman. There's also many false prophets. These were prophets who communicated lies. Often they would cower to political powers and just say whatever the king wanted, things that were not true. A true prophet delivered the word of God, even when the message was hard and there was often a personal cost involved. Jeremiah was often imprisoned because he spoke the truth. So the prophets in the biblical story are more forth-tellers than foretellers. The largest percentage of their message actually details important issues during that time that it was being spoken. Not so much about long-distance future things. The bulk of things were about the immediate context. So some context to keep in mind as you read the prophets is the historical context. We have the time, place, and situation that the prophet is addressing. So for Jeremiah, he's a prophet right before they're about to fall to Babylon, and everyone's about to go into exile. So this is a really dark time for Israel. Kathleen O'Connor writes that although the biblical books associated with the Babylonian period do not provide a systematic history of the times, they offer something better. They preserve stunning testimony that the people of Judah experienced a historic catastrophe. Testimony is speech from inside the events. It does not seek to prove something, but to portray and interpret experience from the inside. The prophetic books of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Lamentations testify in poetry and prose to the whole spectrum of life destroyed during this period. The book of Jeremiah is run with language of annihilation, lament, struggle, explicitly associated with the Babylonian political and military realities. Another context to be aware of is the theological context, and that's the beliefs, ideologies, and assumptions regarding God, the Israelite king, the Israelite people, all these things that shape the prophet's writings. So theological questions asked during this period would be things like, who is God? What is God doing in the world? Who are we as the people of God? How should we live in the world, especially in light of who God is and who we are as the people of God? And then finally, there's the rhetorical context. How the prophets used language that shaped the material in order to persuade and influence their audience. And just so you know, the prophetic language is often full of powerful imagery, metaphors, and poetry. Eugene Peterson describes a prophet this way. A prophet lets people know who God is, what God's like, what God says, and what God's doing. A prophet wakes us up from our sleepy complacency so that we see the great and stunning drama that is our existence, and then pushes us onto the stage, playing our parts, whether we think we're ready or not. A prophet angers us by rejecting our euphemisms and ripping off our disguises, then dragging our hurtless attitudes and selfish motives out into the open, where everyone sees them for what they are. A prophet makes everything and everyone seem significant and important. Important because God has made it, or him or her, and significant because God is actively right now using it, or him or her. A prophet makes it difficult to continue with a sloppy and selfish life. So really, to sum it up, I think what Peterson is trying to say is that prophets remind us that our lives actually matter. Rather than this distant God, right, who's written our stories already, closed the book, I imagine God turning to us and saying, there's a lot of crazy stuff happening in the world, and even in your neighborhood. Let's write our story together. Where should we start? As Peterson has said, your life is significant. God has placed desires and values in you that matter. Part of what happens as we grow in our relationship with God is that we begin to see the things that God cares about, things like loving our neighbors, and they become things that we deeply care about as well. So the language of Jeremiah as a whole is often very intense with some of the metaphors used. He fully expresses a wide range of emotions before God. So during the time of Jeremiah, the people of God were going through a very difficult time. They were about to lose everything to the Babylonian Empire. Everything was about to shift. So Jeremiah's prophetic ministry really kicks off under the reign of King Josiah in 627. Jeremiah's relationships with those in power is very complex. Scribes, priests, kings, other prophets. Jeremiah is continually in harm's way because he's speaking truth to those in powerful positions. We know the most about Jeremiah actually compared to all the other prophets overall, but also we still don't know that much. We know he's from Anathoth. He's from a priestly family, so I think of him as a pastor's kid. The language of the prophet Jeremiah really draws a lot on the book of Deuteronomy, reminding the people of Judah that they've broken covenant, right? Idolatry, social injustice, hypocrisy, and religious practices. So a lot of the language Walter Bruggeman describes the prophet's language as something that has to shock people's sensitivity, call attention to what is not usually noticed, and break the routine. It's like saying, wake up, there's things to do. God is at work. So for Israel, there are certain things that grounded their identity as a people, such as land and temple. We know from this side of history that, of course, this is all about to be destroyed, life as they knew it, gone. Jeremiah is called to preach and teach during this time and to prophesy, a time when all would seem lost, even in the darkest times. But even then, God is doing something new. Jeremiah experienced a lot of ups and downs in his ministry. One of the key takeaways I read in the book of Jeremiah is how much God values relationship with Jeremiah and with us. One of the ways I see this is expressed through God's engagement and encouragement of Jeremiah to express his emotions, especially in Jeremiah 6. God actually encourages Jeremiah to pour out his rage. In sitting with strong and uncomfortable emotions of Jeremiah's, it became a chapter for me and one of my best friends as we were processing just this really intense emotion. She's a therapist, a psychologist at Boston Children's Hospital, and we always go on runs together and we talk on the phone. And we're processing emotions, book of Jeremiah, and and actually we have a chapter coming out, should be coming out this year, in a book titled Showcasing the Psyche in the Bible. It's going to be coming out with Sheffield Phoenix Press. So my friend, Dr. Amy Hale, and I were looking at these emotions actually through the lens of ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. One of the reasons we were drawn to this with Jeremiah is all of the feelings you witness there, all the feels, from weeping to rage. Amy and I, through these runs, that we're huffing and puffing and kind of like really coming up with some interesting ideas and realizing often in churches, many people are told to not feel difficult emotions. Sometimes things are said like, trust God, don't get angry, don't feel that sad, have faith. And although people mean well when these things are said, it really can shortcut the process of people knowing why they are having strong feelings. So I want to share a little bit from Amy and I's research to demonstrate why emotions and all the feels are important for Jeremiah's relationship with God and how this can actually help us navigate our relationship with God and others. So acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, is a therapeutic approach that posits, among other things, that emotions illuminate what is important and alert us that there is something important going on, something that we need to attend to. Through the lens of ACT, anger is understood as a reflection of a person's desire to protect an important boundary and a tool that can help them fight for something that they value. Within many faith communities, of course, anger can be perceived as a bad emotion, one to be censured and avoided, in particular in relation to God. Individuals are told to be thankful and joyful, and although these are good emotions, they often can skim over the experience of anger and miss an opportunity for both personal and spiritual growth and intimacy with God. The prophet Jeremiah serves as an example that even the most intense and seemingly irrational anger, when aligned with divine values, can in fact be a reflection of God and God's desire for God's people. In the book of Jeremiah, we see an example of divine and prophetic rage that calls people to repentance, binds up the brokenhearted, and serves as a light leading towards redemption and right relationship between the rich and the poor. Anger, along with other emotions in the book of Jeremiah, is not something to be feared or avoided, but actually something that provides a pathway towards healing and tenderness, again, between God and God's people. What I found interesting was that after looking at some of Jeremiah's most intense emotions, especially rage, which God encourages Jeremiah to feel, these feelings are connected to his core values. So what are those values? I'm glad you asked. Jeremiah's values actually reveal his heart for God. Rage is this valuable emotion offering an interpretive function and framework in identifying these core values for Jeremiah. As I was researching the two core values that often were connected to his expression of anger, I like to say rage, but they include, the first is covenant faithfulness to God, and also justice for the oppressed and marginalized. I found this core value listed over 14 times. This list reveals a desire to return to faithfulness to God and to themselves. Faithfulness to God and the law and what God desires is bound up with caring for the oppressed, the orphan, the widow, and the marginalized. So Jeremiah's strong emotion of anger reveals actually core values for justice. This is the heart of God. Of course, there are healthy and unhealthy ways to express emotions, but I want to focus on that God encouraged Jeremiah to express them. And ultimately, this expression creates a pathway toward healing and wholeness. The Psalms provide wonderful examples of faith communities expressing all sorts of emotion. And this is healthy for a relationship with God. We do not need to come to God with everything in its proper order. We can be authentic with how we feel, who we are, no matter how messy. Through our praise and in our prayers, God can handle it. In fact, our honesty is a pathway to wholeness. So it is wise to sit with our emotions for a bit. Sometimes we think we hate God, but we just might need to have a snack or a sandwich like my little Sam. Or sometimes, like Jeremiah, a core value of ours is being challenged and a boundary we set up. And we'd be wise to pray and process a bit. Why do I feel so strongly about something? Emotions can be invitations for us to understand the things we care about and what others deeply care about. So as I mentioned before, the people of God were breaking covenant, and this was something that upset Jeremiah. What I find fascinating is that God does not throw up his hands in the air and give up on them, right? No. God does something new. One of the most famous chapters in the book of Jeremiah is chapter 29, where God speaks of this new covenant. You might have heard of that. This covenant is not separate from the older ones, but more like a renewed covenant. This covenant reveals God's investment in God's people, even when they mess up, even when they don't listen to the prophets. Even so, God does not abandon them. Scholar Daniel Block describes this as a renewed covenant. He says, this is not a new covenant in any absolute sense. It signals no deliverance from the law as if it was the law that held the people in bondage like Pharaoh, nor does it signal any adjustment in God's standards of righteousness. On the contrary, it signals a day when finally the Israelites will enjoy the freedom envisioned by the original Israelite covenant. A freedom that celebrates both the knowledge and the application of the teachings, the Torah, because it will be internalized in the hearts of all Israel. For all these reasons, we should look upon the covenant as the renewed covenant that God made long ago with Abraham in Genesis, and he established with the Exodus generation of his descendants at Sinai, and renewed with the conquest generation on the plains of Moab. Then what is new? It is not the essence of the covenant, nor the ability of both partners to keep the covenant. Rather, its newness is found in the nature of the covenant community, as captured in the word, all. They will all know me, from the least to the greatest. God cares greatly about our relationship with God. In fact, here it is, right? The new covenant, Jeremiah 31 through 34. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them. These are metaphors of family. They're very strong and powerful, part of that prophetic rhetoric. So I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my law within them and on their heart. I will write it, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again, each one his neighbor, and each one his brother or sister, saying, Know the Lord, for they will all know me, from the least to the greatest of them, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. Here we see the heart of God for relationship and forgiveness. So the focus here is on this relationship and forgiveness. And we witness this ultimately as expressed through Christ. So this beautiful portrait of relationship, of God continuing to reveal hope even in the darkest moments, is also expressed through a very tangible act on Jeremiah's part. So we have this hope of forgiveness, this new relationship, yet Babylon is literally camped on the borders, right? And about to come in and destroy everything. Their temple, capture people, take over. So is this a good time to buy some land? I think not. Honestly, it's one of the wonkiest real estate purchases in the Bible. It is the wonkiest, if that's a word. So in chapter 32, but I absolutely love what it communicates. In this scene, Jeremiah is making a powerful statement of hope. Eugene Peterson writes, buying this field, this real estate purchase at Anathoth, was this deliberate act of hope. And he says practical, I think a bit impractical, but it has practical implications for sure. So in Peterson's Message version of Jeremiah 32:6, it details this transaction. It says in verse 6, Jeremiah said, God's message came to me like this, prepare yourself, Hanamel. Your uncle, Shallum's son, is on his way to see you, he's going to say, buy my field, right? In Anathoth, you have the legal right to buy it. Sure enough, just as God said, right, his cousin comes to him while Jeremiah is in jail and says, buy my field at Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin, for you have the legal right to keep it in the family. Buy it, take it over. That did it. Jeremiah's like, I knew it was God's message. So I bought the field. I bought it from my cousin. I paid him 17 silver shekels. I followed all the proper procedures in the presence of witnesses. I wrote out the bill of sale, sealed it. Jeremiah details all the very specific things he does. This is a legitimate real estate transaction. Takes the deed of purchase, all of this, with a contract, conditions, all of it. In front of them, he tells Baruch, his scribe, these are the orders from God of the angel armies, the God of Israel. Take these documents, seal them, and the open deeds, put them in safekeeping in a pottery jar. For God of angel armies, the God of Israel says, life is going to return to normal. Home and fields and vineyards are again going to be bought in this country. So here we have the Babylonian Empire about to trample and destroy everything, and Jeremiah buys a family field. Jeremiah had been preaching hope for the future generations, and in this one act reveals the real hope he had in God's promises. Jeremiah did not know the when, but he had the courage to hope and to act. Peterson summarizes, buying that field seems impractical, failing to conform to the visible reality. But in fact, they are the reality that is being constructed, but is not yet visible. Hope connects us to actions that connect to God's promises. God promises to be with us and in relationship with us. So what I find incredible is that even after loss of place, God's people are still connected through their testimony and their faith. They did not have the usual markers of identity, such as a temple and land, but they had their story with God. And God did not abandon them in this time. Their identity as God's people is not about a building, but about keeping covenant, about loving God and loving neighbor. What roots them as God's people is not about where their seat is in church or who bought the donuts, right? But it's about following God. There's real hope and imaginative pathways forward to be found in this life of faith. So today, maybe your act of hope is to believe that you are truly loved and called by God. Maybe you feel inadequate, like Jeremiah or Moses. I encourage you to trust God's work in your life. When you deeply come to know this truth that you are loved, deep healing work begins. You are deeply loved by God, and God is delighted to be in a relationship with you. My apologies for my dogs. Perhaps God is asking you to step out and do something that may seem impractical, but express God's grace to those around you. Jeremiah reminds us that it takes courage to act and hope. Perhaps today, looking at Jeremiah's relationship with God, you may be encouraged to be honest with God about some emotions you've been having. May we find the strength and courage through Christ to continue to hope in all that God may want to do in us and through us this week. So I'd like to end with prayer, and then I'll go ahead and give you a couple resources that you might be interested in if the life of Jeremiah has captured you at all. So I'd like to pray this prayer from Jeremiah 32 as we end our time together. And I'll go ahead and read it, and you can go ahead and bow your heads if you like. Ah, sovereign Lord, you made the heavens and the earth by your great power and outstretched arm. Nothing is too hard for you. Great and mighty God, whose name is the Lord Almighty. Great are your purposes and mighty are your deeds. Your eyes are open to the ways of all humanity. You performed signs and wonders in Egypt and have continued them to this day in Israel and among all of us, and have gained the renown that is still yours. Loving God, please continue your renewed work in us. Help us to hold on to the promises that you are indeed making all things new. You are the beginner and finisher of our faith. Grow us up into your likeness more and more each day. Thank you for this faith community at Crosswalk. Continue to guide this community as they seek to do your will, to love their neighbors near and far, and to be instruments of your peace, healing, and light into this world. In the powerful name of Jesus, amen. All right, so one final thing, I can't leave without a couple book suggestions. I know a lot of you love to study and read and research. So if you're interested in reading more on Jeremiah, I highly recommend one of my favorite books. I used to read this every year for years, and it is, I quoted him today a bit, Eugene Peterson's Run with the Horses. He has a really wonderful writing style just on the life of Jeremiah. He's a scholar and a pastor and all of that, so I highly recommend that text. He's a master storyteller. Another wonderful text is Walter Bruggeman, I think I have it here, The Prophetic Imagination. I think you'll very much be delighted in that text. Also, there's a Bible project online that actually has a great overview of the book of Jeremiah with illustrations. And finally, I use this in my course at Nazarene Theological Seminary when I teach on Jeremiah, but it's Aaron Calmer's Interpreting the Prophets. And so for some of you just want to kind of dig in, it's a book on reading, understanding, and preaching from the worlds of the prophets. So when I talked about all those historical contexts, theological contexts, all of that comes from there, and it kind of helps you get bearings for the world of the prophets. All right. Thank you again for sharing with me today, and I just hope you have a wonderful week.
An awesome and important message for us today. I don't know about you, but I found myself, what Jenny said, in today's world, feeling all the feels, and to be able to know that we have hope, and that's so important in the equation, and God is always in the equation, that we do have hope in God, and also support from our community. I would like to just suggest for you, I know you're probably not going to go out and buy real estate like Jeremiah did, but what deliberate act of hope do you want to include in your life this week?